The galaxy holds 1,000,000 worlds that scream into the warp every second. Hive cities choking on fear, battlefields soaked in rage, shrine worlds humming with devotion, so loud it fractures reality. If the warp listens anywhere, it listens there. So why did it answer a small town? Why did the barrier between real space and the Immaterium weaken not above a fortress world or a holy crusade, but beneath a quiet American town where children rode bicycles and power outages were the worst thing most people ever feared? The Imperium would call it coincidence. The Ordo Malleus would call it anomaly. But the warp does not act by accident. Hawkins was not strong. It was not important. It was not defended. And that is precisely why it mattered. Tonight, we examine a forbidden interpretation that the Upside Down was not a random breach, not a failed experiment, not an alien ecosystem, but a slow, deliberate warp probe, a place chosen not for its power, but for its weakness, a world tested not by invasion, but by exposure, because the warp does not always conquer. Sometimes it studies. If you want to explore the moments where the warp touches reality without warning or mercy, support this channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing it with others who understand that the most dangerous incursions are the ones Imperium never notices in time. Hawkins was not loud. That is the detail most people miss when they try to understand why it mattered. In a galaxy where suffering announces itself in billions of voices, where war zones throb with psychic violence and hive worlds hum with endless desperation, Hawkins barely registered as a whisper. It was a place defined by routine, school bells, diner clocks, the steady comfort of predictability. Fear existed there, but it was small, personal, and contained. Arguments at dinner tables, anxieties about grades, the quiet dread of growing up. In the language of the warp, that kind of fear is almost invisible. The Imperium understands this principle well. Worlds that burn brightly in the Immaterium are watched, warded, and cataloged. Shrine worlds glow with devotion. Fortress worlds pulse with discipline and aggression. Even rebellious planets scream loudly enough to be noticed. Hawkins did none of this. It did not pray. It did not riot. It did not believe in anything strongly enough to leave a mark. It simply existed. And that made it soft. The barrier between real space and the warp is not a wall. It is a tension. It holds where reality pushes back with certainty, through belief, ritual, doctrine, or sheer psychic mass. Where that pressure weakens, reality stretches. Not enough to break, just enough to bend. Hawkins bent easily. There were no priests to sanctify ground. No soldiers trained to recognize the wrongness in the air. No psykers taught to suppress instinct when the world began to feel thin. The people of Hawkins had no language for spiritual threat. When something felt wrong, they called it stress, imagination, coincidence. That misnaming mattered. In Imperial records, the most dangerous warp incursions are not the ones that arrive screaming. They're the ones that arrive politely, wearing the shape of plausibility. A sound explained as faulty wiring, a shadow blamed on fatigue, a missing animal attributed to chance. Each rationalization weakens the mind's resistance, training it to accept intrusion without interpretation. Hawkins excelled at this. It was a town that believed in causes, not meanings, effects, not intentions. Things happened, and then life continued. The very ordinariness of the place acted as camouflage. No one was looking upward. No one was looking inward. There was no expectation that reality could betray them. From the warp's perspective, this was ideal, because the warp does not always seek strength. Strength resists. Strength reacts violently. Strength attracts attention. What the warp needs when it experiments is quiet, a place where observation can occur without interference, where influence can be applied incrementally, where outcomes can be measured without distortion. Hawkins was not chosen because it was weak. It was chosen because it was unguarded. This is a distinction that reframes everything that followed. The Upside Down did not erupt into existence. It did not crash through reality like a blade. It seeped, slowly, carefully, as if testing the temperature of a surface before committing weight. The first changes were environmental, not monstrous. Power flickered without pattern. Compass needles hesitated. Sound carried incorrectly. These were not attacks. They were probes. The warp learning how this reality behaved when stressed, how much pressure it could apply before resistance formed, how long it could linger without provoking panic. Panic would have been counterproductive. Panic attracts attention. Attention invites response. Response invites closure. What the warp found in Hawkins was something far more useful. People who noticed something was wrong and then told themselves it was nothing. Children who felt watched and convinced themselves they were imagining it. Adults who sensed absence and filled it with routine. Every act of self-reassurance thinned the barrier further, not because belief empowered the warp, but because disbelief failed to resist it. This is where the Imperium's doctrines would have intervened, if they had been present on an imperial world. Unexplained phenomena trigger rituals. Incense is burned. Vox channels filled with prayers and warnings. Even false belief creates psychic friction. It announces awareness. Hawkins had none of this. There was no counter-pressure. No narrative strong enough to say, something is wrong and we will name it. Naming matters. The warp feeds on interpretation. It needs minds to assign meaning, even incorrect meaning, to what they experience. But it also benefits when meaning is withheld entirely. When reality is experienced without framework, the warp gains room to define the experience instead. In Hawkins, the warp did not encounter belief. It encountered vacancy. And vacancy, in the Immaterium, is an invitation. By the time the first true breach occurred, when the barrier no longer merely stretched but folded inward, the conditions were already established. Reality had been trained to accept intrusion. Minds had been conditioned to normalize wrongness. The town's emotional profile was stable enough to avoid attracting outside attention, but malleable enough to absorb disturbance. This is why Hawkins survived initial contact. Not because it was strong, not because it was special, but because it did not react correctly. The warp was not interested in conquering a town. It was interested in learning how little effort was required to rewrite one, how memory could be mirrored, how fear could be tuned, how environment could be reshaped to reflect not belief, but familiarity. The upside down would not arrive as a foreign hellscape. It would arrive as a reflection. And Hawkins, too small to matter, too quiet to be noticed, too ordinary to defend itself, provided a perfect test case. A place where the warp could observe without interruption. A place where resistance will be delayed long enough to gather meaningful data. In a galaxy obsessed with scale, Hawkins disappeared beneath notice. And in that disappearance, the warp found exactly what it was looking for. What made Hawkins vulnerable was not ignorance, but trust. Trust in patterns. Trust in routine. Trust in the idea that the world behaves the same way tomorrow as it did yesterday. This kind of trust creates a powerful inertia, one that resists panic long after panic will be rational. For the warp, that inertia is a gift. On worlds accustomed to catastrophe, reality is interrogated constantly. On Hawkins, reality was assumed. When doors creaked open without wind, when lights dimmed at the wrong hour, when the air fell heavier in certain places, the town responded with explanations that closed the question rather than opening it. Electrical faults, old buildings, stress, coincidence. Each explanation was an act of psychic compliance, a decision not to press back. The warp does not need worship to advance. It needs permission to remain. Every time something was dismissed instead of challenged, that permission was renewed. The barrier did not tear because it was attacked. It thinned because no one reinforced it. Reality was allowed to sag under its own unexamined assumptions. In imperial terms, Hawkins failed a test it never knew it was taking. On a compliant imperial world, the first signs of wrongness trigger doctrine. Even the most superstitious response creates friction. Fear is expressed, named ritualized. Hawkins did the opposite. Fear was internalized and minimized. Children felt terror and were told it was imagination. Adults sensed unease and treated it as fatigue. The town collectively trained itself to ignore its own instincts. This produced a very specific psychic environment, not loud enough to attract demons, not structured enough to form cults, but soft enough to be shaped. The warp began to mirror what it found. Not beliefs, but memories. Streets appeared where streets existed. Buildings echoed their real space counterparts, stripped of life but heavy with residue. The upside down did not invent Hawkins. It traced it, carefully, patiently, as if copying a document line by line to understand its structure. This was not invasion. It was rehearsal. The warp was learning how humans inhabit space when they are not actively defending meaning. How environments retain emotional imprint even after people are gone. How absence can be weaponized more effectively than presence. Hawkins provided clean data because it was emotionally legible but ideologically blank. And still, no alarms were triggered. From a wider perspective, Hawkins remained insignificant. No massive psychic flare. No sudden religious fervor. No large-scale violence. Nothing that would draw the attention of institutions designed to watch for catastrophe. The town was being rewritten slowly enough that it never crossed the thresholds those institutions care about. This is the most unsettling aspect of what happened. The warp did not need a dramatic event. It needed time. Time to observe how long it could exist adjacent to reality without being expelled. Time to learn which fears provoke reaction and which were tolerated. Time to see how humans responded when faced with a familiar made hostile. The creatures that eventually emerged were not generals or conquerors. They were instruments, pressure points, probes shaped by what they encountered. Predators tuned to fear responses rather than ideology. They did not arrive speaking or declaring purpose. They hunted quietly, as if refining technique. Everything about Hawkins suggested an experiment. And experiments do not end when they are noticed. They end when the results are sufficient. By the time the town could no longer explain away what was happening. By the time fear overcame routine, the warp had already learned what it needed. It had confirmed that reality could be entered without announcement. That meaning could be bypassed. That resistance could be delayed not by force, but by familiarity. Hawkins was not broken because it was weak. It was broken because it trusted reality to protect itself. That trust failed, and once it failed in one place, the implication was clear. There were countless other places like it. Quiet, ordinary, unimportant. Worlds, towns, populations that did not glow brightly enough to be watched and did not scream loudly enough to be saved. If the warp could learn here, it could learn anywhere. The upside down was not the beginning of an invasion. It was a proof of concept. And proof, once established, does not remain localized for long. The first in place did not announce itself with fire or screams. It arrived as a hesitation, a pause between cause and effect that lingered just long enough to be felt, but not long enough to be named. Lights flickered a fraction of a second too late. Sound arrived softened, as it filtered through distance that did not exist. The air itself felt reluctant, resisting movement in ways no one could quite describe. Hawkins did not recognize these signs as intrusion. It treated them as malfunction. That response was critical. In the Imperium, thin places are feared because they represent a loss of tension. Reality does not tear all at once. It loosens. It stretches where belief is weak or unfocused. When enough of these micro-failures align, the boundary stops behaving like a barrier and begins behaving like a membrane. Hawkins became a membrane. The first disappearance was not interpreted as metaphysical. It was framed as tragedy. A missing child, a search grid, flashlights cutting through woods that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Fear spiked briefly, but it was unstructured. There were no rituals to contain it, no doctrine to aim it outward. The fear folded inward instead, deepening the thinning rather than sealing it. This is how the war prefers to enter, not through terror that unifies resistance, but through anxiety that fragments it. As days passed, the town's emotional profile shifted. Worry replaced routine. Sleep patterns fractured. Dreams grew vivid and repetitive. People began to sense they were being watched, but could not agree by whom or from where. That uncertainty prevented collective response. Each person experienced the pressure privately, convinced that speaking aloud would make them sound unstable. The warp thrives in that silence. What made the first thin place different from every other anomaly was its stability. It did not fluctuate wildly. It held. A region where reality was consistently weaker, consistently more permeable, consistently receptive. The warp did not push harder. It did not need to. It simply maintained presence and observed the results. Environmental feedback followed. Organic matter decayed faster in specific zones. Temperature dropped unpredictably. Time itself behaved incorrectly, moments stretching or compressing without pattern. These were not side effects. They were measurements. The warp adjusting its influence, calibrating how far it could intrude without provoking systemic collapse. On an imperial world, such instability would trigger immediate containment. Seals would be raised, psykers deployed, faith weaponized to reassert boundary. Hawkins had none of this. The town responded with investigation rather than interdiction. Scientists measured effects without understanding cause. Law enforcement searched for suspects that could be arrested. Every wrong response deepened the thin place. Because the warp does not resist inquiry. It welcomes it. Inquiry implies curiosity. Curiosity implies engagement. Engagement creates connection. Each connection, however rationalized, allowed the warp to anchor itself more securely. The thin place stopped being a flaw in reality and became a feature. This is where the upside down began to coalesce, not as a separate realm, but as an echo, a negative space defined by what Hawkins was and what it lacked. Streets mirrored streets, buildings mirrored buildings, but life was absent, replaced by residue. The warp did not invent architecture. It traced it, stripping away function and leaving behind structure infused with emotional memory. This was not malice. It was method. The warp was learning how much reality it needed to replicate in order to remain undetected. How familiar something had to look before humans stopped questioning its wrongness. The upside down did not look alien, because alien draws attention. It looked wrong in subtle ways, forcing recognition without comprehension. That balance is difficult to achieve. The thin place allowed the warp to practice. Creatures emerged only after the environment stabilized. They were not leaders or symbols. They were stress tests. Predators designed to provoke specific reactions. Fear, panic, isolation. Each encounter fed back into the system, teaching the warp how Hawkins responded under pressure. The thin place thickened with data. At no point did the warp attempt full incursion. It did not flood reality with demons or collapse the barrier entirely. That would have ended the experiment. Instead, it maintained restraint, allowing the town to adjust around the intrusion, to normalize it. Normalization is the final stage of thinning. Once the impossible becomes routine, resistance loses urgency. By the time people acknowledged that something was truly wrong, the thin place had already become permanent. Reality no longer snapped back into place. It accepted deformation as baseline. Hawkins had become a control breach. The first of its kind not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most subtle. A place where the warp learned that invasion was unnecessary when coexistence was easier. That reality could be rewritten not through force, but through patience. This is why the thin place mattered. It proved that the warp did not need to wait for wars or cults or prayers. It could begin anywhere belief was absent and resistance delayed. It could enter quietly, learn efficiently, and leave behind a door that no one remembered closing. The Imperium never noticed Hawkins because it was watching for screams. The warp was listening for silence. Once the thin place stabilized, Hawkins stopped behaving like a town and started behaving like a threshold. People moved through familiar spaces with a growing sense that distance no longer worked the way it should. Streets felt longer at night. Hallways seemed to narrow without changing shape. Sound carried unevenly, footsteps echoing too far or not at all. These were not hallucinations. They were early symptoms of spatial negotiation, reality adjusting itself to shared territory. The warp did not push Hawkins aside. It leaned into it. This distinction matters. A violent incursion creates resistance by its very nature. A gradual overlap creates confusion, and confusion prevents coordination. No one knew when the rules had changed, only that they no longer applied consistently. The thin place made Hawkins unreliable, and unreliability eroded trust faster than fear ever could. Trust in maps, trust in memory, trust in one another's accounts. Each contradiction isolated people further, and isolation deepened the thinning. The upside down grew denser as this happened, not expanding outward but inward. It accumulated detail. Textures sharpened. Familiar landmarks became anchors. The warp learned which elements of reality carried the strongest emotional imprint and preserved them. Homes, schools, roads where children once rode bicycles. Places saturated with routine rather than ritual. Routine is easier to copy than faith. What emerged was not a hellscape designed to terrify, but an environment optimized to disorient. It forced recognition without context. Everything looked almost right, and that almost mattered more than total wrongness ever could. Humans confronted with something utterly alien retreat. Humans confronted with something familiar, but corrupted hesitate. Hesitation creates time. Time creates opportunity. The creatures that moved through this space were shaped by that principle. They did not announce themselves. They stalked edges. They responded to sound, to fear spikes, to emotional disturbance. They were not symbols. They were instruments, fine-tuned to exploit uncertainty rather than inspire worship. This alone marks the upside down as different from traditional warp manifestations. There were no sermons, no bargains, no promises, only pressure. The warp was not asking for belief. It was measuring tolerance. How long could a population endure wrongness before it named it? How much loss could be absorbed before meaning was demanded? How many disappearances before explanation replaced denial? Hawkins answered these questions one failure at a time. Each attempt to impose rational explanation over metaphysical intrusion weakened the town's ability to resist. Science without doctrine became another form of engagement. Instruments probed the thin place, recorded anomalies, and inadvertently stabilized them by treating them as natural phenomena rather than existential threats. This is where Imperial doctrine would have intervened brutally, not to save Hawkins, but to prevent learning. Because the most dangerous thing about the thin place was not what it did to the town. It was what it taught the warp. That reality could be studied without provoking defense. That humans would investigate rather than banish. That curiosity could replace caution long enough for patterns to emerge. By the time Hawkins understood that it was not dealing with a problem but a presence, the thin place had already passed its most critical phase. The warp had confirmed that it could establish a semi-stable overlap without alerting larger systems designed to detect catastrophe. This was a success condition. The thin place no longer needed to grow. It had proven its viability. Hawkins did not need to be consumed. It needed to persist, quietly demonstrating that reality could host a warp-adjacent environment indefinitely under the right conditions. From the Imperium's perspective, this was the worst possible outcome. A catastrophic incursion would have been noticed. A demon world would have been burned. A screaming wound in reality draws attention, and attention brings annihilation. Hawkins did none of this. It suffered, adapted, and continued. That endurance was not resilience. It was compatibility. The thin place remained because Hawkins remained. As long as the town existed, as long as people lived, feared, and denied without doctrine, the overlap could be maintained. The warp did not need to escalate. It simply needed to observe. And observation changes the observer as much as the observed. The upside down was no longer just a reflection of Hawkins. It was an interpretation. A version shaped by what the warp had learned about human environments stripped of belief. A model that could be applied elsewhere. This is the implication that turned a local horror into a galactic one. If the warp can create thin places without war, without cults, without gods, then the Imperium's methods of detection are obsolete. It is watching for firestorms while the warp learns to breathe underwater. Hawkins was the first thin place not because it was unique, but because it proved a method. And methods, once proven, do not remain singular for long. The most dangerous thing about the Upside Down was not that it existed. It was that it changed. At first, it was only an echo. A hollow copy of Hawkins stripped of sound, color, and life. Streets without traffic. Buildings without warmth. A world that felt abandoned rather than constructed. If the warp had stopped there, it would have remained a curiosity. A scar where reality had thinned but not surrendered. But it did not stop. The Upside Down began to respond. This response was not dramatic. There were no sudden transformations, no declarations of intent. Instead, there was refinement, details sharpened, Structures aligned more precisely with their real space counterparts. Objects appeared in locations that suggested memory rather than geography. The warp was not creating randomly. It was selecting. Selection implies preference. The upside down preserved what Hawkins remembered most strongly. Schools, homes, familiar paths worn smooth by repetition. Places saturated with routine rather than emotion. These were the easiest to reproduce because they were deeply embedded in the town's collective memory. The warp did not need belief to access them. Habit was enough. This is how it learned. By observing which parts of reality left the strongest imprint when belief was absent. On worlds of faith, symbols dominate. Altars, icons, words repeated until they gain weight. In Hawkins, there were no such anchors. The strongest imprints came from use, not reverence. The warp adapted accordingly. It built a space that felt wrong not because it violated doctrine, but because it violated expectation. Expectation is a subtler defense than belief, but exists nonetheless. The upside down tested it relentlessly. Sound behaved incorrectly, traveling too far or not far enough. Time drifted, moments stretching thin or collapsing without warning. The environment pressed back when entered, resisting movement in ways that suggested intent without articulation. None of this was random. Each deviation probed how humans interpreted disruption when stripped of ritual frameworks. The results were instructive. Humans tried to rationalize. They mapped. They measured. They adapted behavior rather than meaning. When a hallway took longer to traverse, they adjusted pace. When a sound echoed strangely, they learned to move quietly. Survival strategies replaced comprehension. The warp noted this and refined the environment to reward such adaptation. This is how learning occurs in the Immaterium, not through study, but through feedback. Fear responses were cataloged. Panic produced spikes that destabilized the overlap briefly, attracting unwanted attention. Controlled fear, however, sustained the environment without collapse. The warp adjusted its pressures accordingly. Predators emerged that punished panic but rewarded silence. Creatures tuned not to aggression, but to sound, movement, and emotional disturbance. These were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were instruments. Each encounter tested a hypothesis. How much fear could be induced without triggering collective action? How much loss could occur before humans demanded explanation? How long could reality remain compromised before resistance shifted from denial to belief? The upside down evolved alongside these questions. It grew more efficient, less chaotic, more selective. It did not expand indiscriminately. It refined what already existed, like a sculptor removing excess material. The warp carved away elements that did not contribute to the experiment. Life was unnecessary. Noise was counterproductive. Clarity was dangerous. What remained was a space optimized for observation. The upside down was not trying to be understood. It was trying to understand. This is where the idea of accident becomes untenable. Accidents do not iterate. They do not improve. They do not respond to stimuli with adjustment. The upside down did all of these things. It behaved like a system refining itself in response to a test environment. Hawkins was that environment. Every incursion into the upside down fed the process. Each human presence provided data. How they moved, what they feared, what they remembered. The warp absorbed this information not consciously, but structurally. The environment shifted to reflect patterns that persisted across encounters. This is why certain locations became focal points. Not because they were important in a cosmic sense, but because they were emotionally dense. Places where choices had been made, where relationships had formed, where fear had been confronted and survived. The warp preserved these locations because they carried usable information about human resilience. Resilience is as important to the warp as weakness. An environment that collapses immediately teaches nothing. An environment that resists entirely reveals nothing. Hawkins occupied the optimal middle ground. It bent without breaking. It adapted without understanding. It endured. And endurance taught the warp something crucial. Humans do not need belief to survive proximity to the Immaterium. They need routine, familiarity, the ability to normalize the impossible, as long as it does not demand interpretation. This realization changes everything. If the warp can learn to coexist with human reality without provoking belief, then belief is no longer its only vector. Worship becomes optional. Cult becomes unnecessary. The warp can insert itself into the margins of ordinary life and reshape reality slowly, patiently, without triggering the alarms that belief inevitably raises. The upside down was not a destination. It was a prototype, a space where the warp learned how to mirror, adapt, and persist in a belief-poor environment, a model for future incursions that would not announce themselves as hells, but as reflections that feel wrong only when examined too closely. By the time Hawkins understood that the upside down was changing, it was already too late to reverse the process. The warp had learned what it needed, and learning, once complete, does not remain contained. As the upside down learned, it also simplified. Complexity is wasteful in the warp. What cannot be used is discarded. What does not produce response is removed. Over time, the mirrored world shed anything that did not serve observation. Color drained further. Sound flattened. Movement became deliberate rather than incidental. The environment stopped feeling abandoned and began to feel intentional. This was the moment the experiment crossed a threshold. The upside down no longer merely reflected Hawkins. It began to anticipate it. Paths shifted subtly toward places of emotional relevance. Structures aligned to funnel movement rather than mirror geography. The space learned where humans would go under pressure and adjusted itself accordingly. Corners became traps not through architecture, but through expectation. What felt like the safest route was often the most exposed. This is how the warp applies intelligence. Not through planning, but through convergence. Repeated human behavior carved grooves into the environment. The warp did not need to think. It needed only to preserve patterns that worked. Over time, the upside down behaved less like a place and more like a response surface, reacting predictably to predictable stimuli. Fear sharpened this process. Not raw terror, which spiked and collapsed too violently, but controlled fear, the kind that tightens focus, slows breathing, and forces calculation. The warp learned that humans under controlled fear were more informative. They moved deliberately. They tested boundaries. They adapted rather than fled. So the environment punished panic and rewarded restraint. Creatures responded to sound rather than sight. Pursuit was triggered by emotional disturbance rather than proximity. Silence became camouflage. Stillness became survival. The warp was not teaching these rules deliberately, but the environment reinforced them naturally as part of the feedback loop. This is how doctrine forms without being spoken. The upside down became a place where meaning was unnecessary, but behavior was critical. A world that did not care what you believed, only how you reacted. This alone separates it from traditional warp domains, which thrive on symbolism and narrative. The upside down was indifferent to story. It wanted data. This indifference made it more dangerous. Humans confronting demons understand, instinctively, that they face something hostile and alien. Humans confronting the upside down face something that behaved like a system. It did not tempt. It did not threaten. It did not explain. It simply responded. Response is harder to resist than intention. As encounters continued, the warp began to refine scale. It learned how much presence was too much. Large incursions destabilized a thin place, drawing attention and risking collapse. Small, precise manifestations maintained pressure without provoking systemic reaction. The warp adjusted accordingly, favoring minimal force applied at optimal moments. This restraint was not mercy. It was efficiency. By now, the upside down had accumulated enough understanding to generalize. Hawkins was no longer unique. It was exemplary. The conditions that allowed the thin place to persist, low belief, high routine, delayed interpretation, were not rare. They existed anywhere meaning had been stripped in favor of function. The Imperium creates such places constantly. Worlds where faith has been suppressed but not replaced with doctrine. Populations taught to endure without ritual. Civilians who accept suffering as background noise rather than something to be named. These environments glow faintly in the warp, not as beacons, but as voids where resistance is slow to form. Hawkins taught the warp how to exploit that void. This is the most dangerous lesson of all, that the warp does not need humanity's worship to survive proximity. It needs only humanity's silence. The absence of belief creates a smooth surface across which influence can spread undetected. The upside down in this context was never meant to be permanent. It was a sandbox, a controlled environment where the warp could test coexistence strategies without risking confrontation. Once sufficient data was gathered, persistence became optional, and persistence is the most frightening outcome, because a breach that closes can be explained as an anomaly. A breach that remains stable without escalation rewrites assumptions. It suggests that reality itself can host the warp quietly, indefinitely, without collapse. If that is true, then the Imperium's understanding of warp threat is incomplete. It watches for storms. It prepares for invasions. It fears belief, but it does not watch for curiosity. The upside down was curiosity given shape, a place where the warp learned not how to conquer, but how to remain, how to inhabit the margins of ordinary life without triggering defense. By the time Hawkins began to fight back effectively, the lesson had already been learned. Resistance was no longer the variable being tested. Adaptation was. And adaptation, once achieved, does not require the original environment to continue. Hawkins survived, battered but intact. The upside down did not need to destroy it. The experiment had succeeded. Somewhere in the Immaterium, the data persisted, patterns extracted, refined, ready to be applied wherever conditions repeated themselves. The warp had learned how to enter quietly, and a galaxy that only listens for screams will never hear it coming. The Imperium did not fail to notice Hawkins because it was negligent. It failed because its senses are tuned to a very specific kind of disaster. Across the galaxy, the Imperium listens for volume. It watches for mass belief, for psychic surges that spike like flares in the Immaterium. Shrine worlds blaze with devotion. War zones burn with rage. Rebellions throb with fear and desperation. These are the signals the Imperium is built to detect, catalog, and respond to. They are loud. They are unmistakable. They announce themselves. Hawkins did none of this. It did not erupt in worship. It did not collapse into hysteria. It did not spiral into collective terror. Its fear remained personal, localized, fragmented. That fragmentation was critical. Psychic noise only becomes visible at scale. Individual dread, unstructured and unshared, dissipates before it can register as threat. From terror's perspective, Hawkins was silent. The Imperium also relies on doctrine to interpret what it hears. When anomalies occur, they are classified against known categories: demonic incursion, psyker instability, cult activity, Xenos interference. Each category carries expected signatures. Hawkins matched none of them cleanly. There were no chants, no symbols, no mass possession, no coordinated heresy, just absence, an absence of resistance, an absence of explanation, an absence of meaning. That absence does not trip alarms. Imperial detection assumes that the warp expresses itself through excess emotion, excess belief, excess violence. The upside down expressed itself through restraint. It did not spike. It did not surge. It lingered at levels too low to be flagged, too stable to be alarming. Stability is misleading. In Imperial doctrine, stability implies containment. A warp anomaly that does not escalate is assumed to be self-limiting, something that can be quarantined by neglect. Hawkins appeared to be exactly that, a minor irregularity that did not spread, did not intensify, and did not threaten Imperial assets. If anyone had been watching closely enough to notice, but Hawkins did not exist in Imperial records. It was too small, too culturally insignificant, too far removed from the rhythms of Imperial life. The Imperium is vast, and its attention is finite. It focuses on places that matter strategically, spiritually, or economically. Hawkins mattered in none of those ways. This is the Imperium's blind spot. It does not monitor quiet places, because quiet places do not destabilize supply lines or threaten doctrine. The warp exploited that assumption. It chose a location that would not justify investigation, even if something felt wrong. There were no reports because there was no one to report to. The Imperium also assumes that belief precedes incursion. This assumption is foundational. It underpins every strategy, every purge, every act of suppression. The idea that gods must be invited, that demons require worship or cults to gain foothold. Hawkins shattered that model quietly. The warp did not wait for belief. It did not require invitation. It simply entered where belief was absent. This possibility does not exist in imperial threat matrices. A world stripped of faith is assumed to be safe. Secular populations are treated as stable, resistant to warp corruption because they do not generate the narratives that feed it. Hawkins was secular not by doctrine, but by apathy. It did not deny meaning. It ignored it. That difference was decisive. The warp did not encounter resistance framed as disbelief. It encountered indifference. And indifference does not push back. It yields slowly, almost politely, allowing influence to seep in without confrontation. Even if Hawkins had been noticed, it would have been misclassified. An anomaly without cult activity would be logged as environmental. Spatial irregularities without mass hysteria would be attributed to natural phenomena or Xeno's remnants. Disappearances without ideological motive would be treated as criminal or tragic, not metaphysical. Every classification would have been wrong, and wrong classifications do not escalate. By the time the Upside Down reached a point where it could no longer be dismissed, the Imperium systems would have already failed to capture its origin. Without origin, there is no doctrine. Without doctrine, there is no response. This is why the Imperium never noticed Hawkins. Not because it was blind, but because it was looking for the wrong things. It listened for screams and missed the silence. It watched for fires and ignored the slow frost. The warp did not announce itself because it did not need to. It chose a place where being unnoticed was part of the environment, where lack of attention was a default state. Hawkins was invisible because it had always been invisible. And in that invisibility, the warp found freedom. Freedom to observe. Freedom to learn. Freedom to leave behind a model that could be replicated anywhere the Imperium assumed safety. This was not a failure of vigilance. It was a failure of imagination. The Imperium could not conceive of a warp incursion that did not demand belief, fear, or spectacle. Hawkins proved that conception incomplete, and what the Imperium does not conceive, it cannot defend against. There is another reason the Imperium never noticed Hawkins, and it is more unsettling than bureaucratic blindness. The Imperium does not merely detect threats. It filters them. Across its vast networks of data scribes, astropaths, and cogitators, information is constantly sorted according to priority. Worlds that scream are elevated. Worlds that whisper are buried beneath noise. This is not negligence. It is survival. An empire that tried to respond to every anomaly would collapse under its own attention. Hawkins never rose above the threshold of concern. Even if fragments of data had surfaced, minor spatial irregularities, unexplained disappearances, localized environmental decay, they would have been contextualized as statistical inevitabilities. In an Imperium of 1,000,000 worlds, small towns vanish every day. Not every loss is metaphysical. Most are simply forgotten. The warp understood this economy of attention. It did not seek to hide completely. That would have required effort and risked error. Instead, it positioned itself below notice. It allowed enough disturbance to test reality, but not enough to justify escalation. The Upside Down existed in the margin between concerning and actionable, a space where things are acknowledged briefly and then dismissed. This margin is enormous. Entire populations live and die within it. The Imperium's greatest strength, its ability to prioritize overwhelming threats, is also its greatest vulnerability. It assumes that danger announces itself proportionally, that the scale of a threat correlates with the scale of its expression. Hawkins violated that assumption. It demonstrated that a threat could be precise rather than vast, subtle rather than explosive. Precision is harder to detect than power. The Imperium also relies on precedent. Every response is shaped by what has happened before. Demonic incursions follow patterns. Warp storms behave predictably. Cult activity leaves recognizable scars. Hawkins fit none of these precedents. There was no language to describe it, and what cannot be described cannot be acted upon. This is where the Upside Down became truly dangerous. Not because it threatened Hawkins, but because it threatened the Imperium's confidence in its own models. If the warp can enter reality without belief, without cults, without mass emotion, then the Imperium's understanding of causality is incomplete. And an incomplete model is worse than ignorance, because it breeds false certainty. The Imperium believes it knows how corruption begins. Hawkins proved it did not. Yet even if this realization had surfaced, it would have been suppressed, not out of malice, but necessity, to acknowledge that the warp can operate quietly would force a restructuring of doctrine, surveillance, and response across the entire Imperium. It would imply that countless worlds assumed to be safe are, in fact, vulnerable. That kind of revelation is destabilizing. The Imperium does not adapt quickly to destabilizing truths. It absorbs them slowly, if at all, often centuries too late to matter. Hawkins would have required the Imperium to admit that silence is not safety, and that absence of belief does not equate to resistance. Such an admission would undermine the logic of countless policies. Better than to never notice at all. So Hawkins remained what it had always been, a statistical non-event. A footnote swallowed by scale. The warp did not need to erase records or falsify data. It relied on volume, on the fact that a galaxy-sized empire cannot afford to care about everything. This is the final lesson Hawkins taught. Not that the Imperium is weak, but that it is optimized for the wrong threats. The warp does not always seek to be feared. Sometimes it seeks to be ignored. Sometimes it prefers environments where nothing feels important enough to protect, where loss is accepted as background noise rather than catastrophe. Hawkins was never defended because it was never valued, and value, in the Imperium, is the first layer of protection. By the time the Imperium would have had reason to notice, there would have been nothing left to see. No explosion, no invasion, just a quiet town that endured something it could not name and survived just long enough to teach the warp what it needed to know. The Upside Down did not expose a weakness in Hawkins. It exposed a weakness in the Imperium itself. A blind spot not in vision, but in assumption. And once a blind spot is mapped, it can be exploited anywhere. The Imperium teaches that the warp is loud, that it announces itself through screaming prophets, burning skies, and gods that demand to be named. It teaches that corruption is dramatic, unmistakable, and catastrophic. That when reality fails, it does so violently enough to justify annihilation. Entire doctrines are built on this assumption, because it is comforting. Loud threats can be found. Loud threats can be burned away. Silence is harder. Hawkins revealed a version of the warp that does not roar. A warp that does not hunger for worship or conquest, but for opportunity. A warp content to remain adjacent to reality, rather than consume it outright. The Upside Down was not a battlefield. It was a listening post. This is a distinction that reshapes everything. The warp did not choose Hawkins to prove its power. It chose it to test restraint, to see whether reality could be entered without triggering the reflexes designed to destroy it. Hawkins answered that question quietly and conclusively. Yes, the town survived long enough to demonstrate compatibility. Reality bent without collapsing. Humans adapted without understanding. Fear circulated without crystallizing into belief. The warp learned that it did not need to dominate in order to persist. It needed only to remain unchallenged. This is the kind of success the Imperium never measures. Victory to the Imperium is decisive. A world saved, a cult purged, a demon banished. Hawkins offered none of these outcomes. There was no final battle, no cleansing fire, no clear end state. There was only endurance, and endurance favors the patient. The Upside Down did not need to spread. Its continued existence was the proof. As long as a warp-adjacent environment could persist without escalation, it validated a new approach, one that did not rely on spectacle or belief, one that could be applied anywhere silence outweighed vigilance. This is why the warp prefers silence. Silence allows experimentation without interruption. It allows errors to be corrected without consequence. It allows reality to acclimate gradually, reducing shock and resistance. Loud incursions provoke reaction. Quiet ones normalize. Normalization is the true victory condition. Once an anomaly becomes part of the background, it ceases to be treated as a threat. People adjust. Institutions ignore. Doctrine remains unchanged. The warp thrives in that stagnation, Not because it grows stronger, but because nothing pushes back. Hawkins normalized the impossible. That normalization did not end when the immediate crisis passed. The town carried residue. Memories distorted by half-understood trauma. Spaces that never felt quite right again. People who learned, subconsciously, that reality could fail and still be lived in. This is how silence propagates. Not through expansion, but through precedent. If one place can endure a thin place without collapse, then the concept of safe reality is already compromised. The warp does not need to replicate Hawkins. Exactly. It needs only to replicate the conditions that allowed it to exist undetected. Those conditions are common. Places where belief has eroded, but doctrine has not replaced it. Communities stripped of ritual and meaning in the name of efficiency. Populations trained to endure quietly, to accept loss without explanation, to normalize anxiety as background noise. The Imperium creates such places constantly. Worlds optimized for output rather than resilience. Civilians taught obedience without spiritual framework. Entire sectors where faith is minimal, not because of enlightenment, but because of exhaustion. These are not protected spaces. They are invitations. The warp does not need to announce itself to these places. It needs only to arrive and wait, to apply pressure slowly, to observe which fears surface, which behaviors repeat, which forms of adaptation emerge. Hawkins was not the beginning. It was confirmation. The Imperium fears belief because belief feeds the warp. But Hawkins suggests something worse, that the absence of belief can be just as fertile, that a population stripped of meaning may offer less resistance than one armored in faith. However dangerous that faith may be, silence does not repel the warp. It shelters it. This realization is incompatible with imperial doctrine. To accept it would require admitting that suppression alone is insufficient. That meaning, however risky, provides structure. That a world without belief is not neutral ground, but soft ground. So the Imperium does not accept it. It continues to listen for screams. And the warp continues to whisper. Hawkins was a place where the whisper was loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to be ignored. A place where the warp learned that it could coexist with reality not by overwhelming it, but by inhabiting its margins. The upside down did not prove that the warp could invade a small town. It proved that it did not need to invade at all. When the warp learns to prefer silence, war becomes unnecessary. This is the final implication of Hawkins, and the one the Imperium would never allow itself to consider. A galaxy prepared for endless battle is poorly equipped to recognize threats that do not fight. The Imperium's greatest weapons are designed to respond to escalation. Its doctrines are built around crisis. Its faith teaches vigilance against spectacle. Silence bypasses all this. The Upside Down did not seek to replace Hawkins. It coexisted with it long enough to demonstrate a principle, that reality can host a warp quietly, indefinitely, without drawing the attention of those sworn to protect it. That coexistence is not stable in a moral sense, but it is stable in a functional one. Functional stability is enough. The warp does not require domination. It requires persistence. A thin place that remains open but contained teaches more than any catastrophic breach. It reveals how humans adapt when they cannot fight meaningfully, how they endure wrongness without language, how they continue to live in spaces that should not exist. Hawkins showed that humans are capable of extraordinary normalization. They adjust to the impossible not by understanding it, but by incorporating it into routine. Trauma becomes background noise. Fear becomes manageable. The extraordinary becomes inconvenient rather than intolerable. This is not weakness. It is survival instinct misapplied to an existential threat. The warp recognized this immediately. A population that can normalize intrusion is more valuable than one that resists violently. Resistance burns out. Normalization persists. It creates an environment where the warp can remain present without provoking purges, crusades, or annihilation. This is the danger the Imperium is not watching for. Not invasion, not corruption, but accommodation. Accommodation does not trigger alarms. It does not create martyrs or heretics. It does not form cults. It produces survivors who carry altered assumptions about reality forward without realizing it. These assumptions spread quietly, that the world is unreliable, That safety is provisional. That wrongness can be endured. Each assumption weakens resistance elsewhere. Each makes the next thin place easier to establish. The warp does not need to expand aggressively when it can seed environments that accept its presence as a given. Hawkins was one such seed. It did not need to become a demon world. It needed only to exist long enough to prove the concept. The upside down was never meant to be a final state. It was a method tested under controlled conditions. Once the method worked, persistence became optional. The Imperium's tragedy is that it interprets quiet as success. A threat that does not escalate is assumed to be contained. A world that continues to function is assumed to be safe. Hawkins continued. Therefore it was safe. This logic is fatal. Safety, in the context of the warp, is not the absence of catastrophe. It is the presence of resistance. Hawkins lost that resistance early and replaced it with endurance. Endurance kept people alive, but it taught the warp something far more valuable than destruction ever could. It taught it how to stay. The warp prefers silence because silence is patient, because silence does not provoke response, because silence allows influence to spread without being named. Once named, something can be fought. Until then, it is simply lived with. The Imperium's faith in loud danger blinds it to quiet occupation. Hawkins was not a warning. It was a demonstration. A small town where the warp learned that it could coexist with humanity not by becoming a god, not by demanding worship, not by shattering reality, but by waiting for reality to stop pushing back. In a galaxy that listens only for screams, the most dangerous thing the warp can do is learn to whisper. And Hawkins was where it learned how.